It began with a sound most people never hear in movies: the low, hollow groan of steel under strain, the slow slap of waves against a hull moving through darkness. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, a merchant ship pushed forward without lights, without escort, carrying food, fuel, and hope across thousands of miles of open water. For the men on board, there was no battlefield to see, only black water and colder air, only the quiet understanding that somewhere beneath the surface, something might already be moving toward them. If you want to understand how World War II was truly decided, you do not start in Berlin. You do not start in Normandy. You start here, on the sea, on routes marked by invisible lines that stretched from North America to Britain, from the Caribbean to Europe, from factories to front lines. Because this war, more than any other before it, was not won by who fired the most shots. It was won by who could move the most things. By 1939, Britain was an island that could not feed itself. More than half of its food, nearly all of its oil, and most of its raw materials came by ship. Every loaf of bread, every tank of fuel in a Spitfire, every shell fired by an artillery gun depended on steel hulls crossing water controlled by no one. Adolf Hitler understood this. He did not need to invade Britain to defeat it. He only needed to starve it. And so, before the first bombs fell on London, before soldiers crossed borders in Europe, the war had already begun beneath the waves. German submarines, known as U-boats, slipped into the Atlantic with the single purpose: find the ships and send them to the bottom. For the men commanding those submarines, the ocean was not a place. It was a hunting ground. They called it the tonnage war. Not a war of cities captured or armies destroyed, but a war measured in numbers printed on a board. How many ships sunk this month? How many tons of cargo lost? How many days Britain could survive if the lines were cut? In September 1939, the British Admiralty still believed it could protect its convoys the way it had in the First World War. Escort ships, patrol zones, experience. Tradition. What they did not yet understand was that technology had changed the ocean itself. U-boats could now travel farther, stay submerged longer, and coordinate attacks using radio. They did not strike alone. They hunted in groups. When one submarine found a convoy, it did not attack immediately. It reported. And then, like wolves closing in from different directions, others came. The first months were a warning, not a catastrophe. Ships were lost, but Britain endured. The true danger had not yet arrived. It would come when the war spread across an ocean. In the spring of 1940, the map of Europe folded in on itself. Norway fell. France collapsed. The German flag rose over ports that faced directly into the Atlantic: Brest, Lorient, St. Nazaire. From these harbors, U-boats no longer had to cross the narrow, heavily patrolled North Sea. They could slip straight into the open ocean. For the men who commanded them, this felt like the door to a vast, dark room had finally been unlocked. They called it the first happy time. British convoys were still organized for the old war. Escort ships were few, slow, and often armed with little more than depth charges dropped into empty water. Many merchant captains still believed the greatest danger came near the coast, not in the middle of the Atlantic where no one could hear a distress call and no aircraft could reach. U-boat commanders learned to wait. At night, they did not dive. They surfaced. A submarine on the surface was faster than most cargo ships. From a distance, its low silhouette looked like just another shadow on the water. They would slip between columns of ships, fire torpedoes at close range, and disappear before anyone could tell where the attack had come from. The sea itself seemed to turn against the convoy. Burning fuel spread across the surface. Flares cut through the darkness. And in that sudden, harsh light, every ship stood exposed. The losses mounted. By the end of 1940, vast amounts of shipping rested on the ocean floor. Food cargoes, oil tankers, steel, grain, crates of vehicles and supplies that would never reach their destination. In London, Winston Churchill later reflected that what truly unsettled him during the war was not air raids, not invasion plans, not even the fall of France. It was the struggle across the Atlantic. Because this was a fight that left little room for the familiar images of bravery. There were no sweeping charges, no banners planted on hills. Only men in engine rooms as water surged in, radio operators repeating the same brief message until their signal faded away. Ship torpedoed. Across the ocean, the United States observed and held back, officially neutral, quietly aware that if Britain failed, the Atlantic would no longer serve as a barrier. It would become a passage. American factories were already filling ships with weapons and supplies under a program known as Lend-Lease. Tanks, trucks, aircraft parts, food. Everything that could be fitted into a hull. And every one of those hulls had to make the same crossing. By 1941, the war at sea was no longer confined to Europe. It was expanding beyond it. December 1941 did not open with a convoy. It opened with fire in the Pacific. When word of Pearl Harbor reached across the ocean, it did more than draw the United States into the conflict. It stripped away the Western Atlantic's sense of distance. Overnight, the sea was no longer a line between war and peace. It became a front, and the U-boats were already there. German commanders had prepared a plan with a quiet, almost simple name, Operation Paukenschlag. Drumbeat. The idea was not to fight the U.S. Navy head-on. It was to hunt the coast itself. In January 1942, the first submarines appeared off the eastern seaboard of the United States. From Florida to New York, cities still glowed at night. Boardwalks were lit, hotels burned with electric light, car headlights traced bright lines along coastal roads. Against that glow, merchant ships became silhouettes. U-boat crews could see their targets without using radar. They did not need complicated tactics. They fired torpedoes and watched explosions light up the horizon like distant storms. American defenses were unprepared. There were no coastal blackouts. Convoys were slow to organize. Escort ships were scattered across oceans, still committed to the Pacific. The result was one of the most lopsided periods of the entire war at sea. Tankers burned within sight of shore. Cargo ships sank so close to land that lifeboats washed up on beaches. Local newspapers printed lists of wrecks like Tide reports. For German submariners, it felt like another happy time. For Allied shipping, it was a hemorrhage. But the ocean does not belong to hunters forever. The Allies began to learn. Slowly, painfully, blackouts were enforced along the coast. Convoys were finally organized. Civilian fishing boats were pulled into service as patrol craft. The U.S. Navy expanded training at a speed that matched the crisis. And behind the scenes, something else was changing the war in ways most sailors would never see. In Britain, codebreakers at Bletchley Park were listening. German U-boats relied on radio to coordinate their attacks. Every report, every call for reinforcements, every update on a convoy's position passed through encrypted messages sent across the air. The Enigma machine was meant to make those messages unreadable. It did not. By mid-1942, Allied intelligence could sometimes see the battle before it happened. They could reroute convoys around wolf packs. They could send escorts to the right place instead of the empty ocean. Not every message was broken. Not every convoy was saved. But for the first time, the tide began to resist the pull. At sea level, the war still felt the same. Long watches, cold air, the constant waiting. But above and beyond the waves, the Atlantic was becoming a place of shadows and signals, of invisible lines drawn between radios, radars, and mines working in rooms far from the water. The battle was no longer just steel against steel. It was information against silence. The ocean had always been wide. Now, for the first time, it began to feel smaller. What changed the Battle of the Atlantic was not a single ship or a single weapon. It was the sky. Aircraft, once limited to hugging coastlines, began to reach farther and farther out over open water. The empty middle of the ocean, the place sailors called the air gap, started to disappear. At first, the planes were awkward tools for a naval war, slow, short-ranged. Their crews searched for dark shapes in darker water, often guided by nothing more than instinct and the faint smear of oil on the surface. But technology kept moving forward, even when ships did not. Radar gave the sky eyes. From miles away, a blip on a screen could reveal a submarine running on the surface. Ley lights, powerful searchlights mounted under aircraft wings, could suddenly turn night into day for a U-boat crew that believed it was hidden. A submarine that once felt like a predator began to feel like something being hunted. In 1943, the Allies introduced escort carriers. Small, almost fragile-looking ships that carried a handful of aircraft, but they carried them where it mattered, into the center of the Atlantic. Over the convoys. Over the routes the U-boats had once ruled. Now, a wolf pack could be spotted before it closed in. A submarine forced to dive too early would lose speed, lose visibility, and lose the initiative. The ocean floor began to collect different wrecks. May 1943 marked a turning point. In that single month, German U-boat losses reached levels that could not be replaced. Crews trained for months vanished in hours. Boats built with scarce steel and labor never returned from patrol. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the man who had shaped the U-boat war from the beginning, faced a truth he had tried to outrun. The Atlantic was no longer a place his submarines could survive. He ordered many of them withdrawn. On the Allied side, the numbers told a different story. Ships were still lost. Men still died. But for the first time since the war began, more tonnage crossed the ocean than sank beneath it. Factories in the United States were now producing ships faster than Germany could destroy them. Liberty ships, simple and rough, rolled off assembly lines in weeks instead of months. Their crews joked that the ships were built so fast that they might still be warm from the welding torch when they touched water. It was not elegance that mattered, it was volume. Every ship that survived the crossing carried not just cargo, but momentum. Tanks for armies that did not yet exist on the map. Fuel for planes that had not yet taken off. Food for men who had not yet landed on foreign beaches. The Battle of the Atlantic was quietly becoming something else. It was becoming a promise. That when the time came, the war would no longer be fought only at sea. By 1944, the Atlantic no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a corridor. Across it moved something the world had never seen before. An army not of men, but of objects. Ships, planes, trucks, fuel drums, crates of ammunition, boxes of rations, coils of wire, planks of steel. A moving continent floating. The preparations for Normandy did not begin on the beaches of France. They began months earlier, in shipyards, warehouses, and rail yards across North America and Britain. Every landing craft launched, every tank loaded, every ration pack depended on one quiet fact. The sea lanes were open. Convoys now crossed in numbers that would have been unthinkable in 1941. Escort screens stretched for miles. Aircraft circled above like patient guardians. Radar swept the water in invisible arcs. The wolf packs that once stalked these routes were gone or silent. The invasion fleet assembled piece by piece, like a machine too large for any single person to comprehend. On June 6, 1944, when soldiers stepped onto the beaches of Normandy, the moment felt sudden, explosive, final. But the real landing had already happened. It had happened in the holds of ships that arrived every day without fanfare, in the fuel that powered engines, in the food that kept men standing, in the spare parts that kept vehicles moving inland instead of rusting at the water's edge. Even after the beaches were taken, the Atlantic did not rest. The Allies built artificial harbors, mulberries, to keep supplies flowing when ports lay in ruins. Ships lined up offshore like a floating city, unloading a war-won crate at a time. Millions of tons crossed the same water that had once been a killing ground. Germany could still fight on land. It could still destroy. But it could not replace what the sea delivered. The war on shipping had not failed in a single moment. It had been outgrown. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, no one held a ceremony for the Atlantic. There were parades in cities. There were speeches on balconies. There were flags and crowds and photographs that would fill books for generations. Out at sea, the water looked the same as it always had. But the numbers told a story that no camera could capture. More than 3,500 merchant ships were lost. Tens of thousands of sailors, from many nations, never returned to shore. German U-boat crews disappeared into the ocean in numbers so large that training pipelines struggled to keep pace. On paper, it appeared as a naval campaign. In reality, it was a contest of endurance. Britain's survival often depended on margins measured in weeks of food. The Soviet Union received millions of tons of supplies through Arctic convoys that pushed through ice and long nights. American factories transformed raw materials into ships, and ships into presents, and presents into a reach that extended beyond any single coastline. The Atlantic became a network. Steel moved to fuel. Fuel moved to engines. Engines moved to roads. Roads moved to front lines. A chain that began in a mine, a field, or a factory and ended in a soldier's hands. And once that chain could no longer be severed, the direction of the war became a matter of time rather than chance. The people who served in the Battle of the Atlantic rarely witnessed a clear moment of victory. There was no single scene to point to, no opposing fleet lowering its flags on the horizon, only a gradual shift in how the sea was experienced. From a place of uncertainty to a place of passage, from a contested space to a working route. If you stand on a coast today and watch cargo ships move across the water, they seem slow, almost calm. Containers stacked in clean, even lines. Yet each of those ships carries a quiet legacy from that war, from the nights when sailors waited in the dark, listening for a sound they hoped would never hear. The Battle of the Atlantic did not shape the war with a final strike. It shaped it by allowing everything else to move forward.